because they always leave us with a lot of little wonderful nuggets. Thanks all.
Hi, welcome everybody. So before we get started, I was hoping that you could take a moment to reflect and share either out loud or in chat what leadership means to you. Just get some of that bunch juices moving. And while you reflect on how hard that might be, I was sharing earlier that this was much more difficult than preparing for an entire day-long workshop. Helping others grow. Leadership means listening and learning, bringing people together in service of a common goal, removing barriers, being an example of thoughtful integrity from whatever role you're in. Leadership as practice, helping others to have agencies in their roles and to help them grow. Involves an ethic of care, is a privilege and opportunity to impact those around us, setting the positive standard for how your team will interact and work together. Providing vision and care and helping people achieve potential. I know I missed one. Seeing the connections and opportunities. So I'm going to share my screen and invite you to, of course, continue engaging with each other in chat. I will not always be quite as attentive as I might be if I wasn't presenting. So many of you probably know, but I had to help myself be centered for today, that HerStory is really meant to decenter singular dominant histories. And so I'm going to use my winding path and experiences to decenter masculine, power-based and privilege-based leadership. That's my hope. You can let me know how I did at the end. I wanted to start by actually centering myself in my identity wheel, because it is so critical. Our identities define how we experience the world, and they're embedded in our values, our biases, and our daily actions. So in many ways, if they're inseparable from leadership, even when I was getting management training the first time around, we're supposed to leave our personal lives at the door. And I think those myths are getting dispelled. But yet for leadership, we often still presume that they are, leader is separate from human. And so for me, some of my key identity are that I am both cisgendered and female. I am disabled, and I have been since the age of 8, though I didn't identify as disabled probably until my early 20s. And even then was very quiet about it until my deanship. I'm a first-generation college graduate. In fact, my mother did not graduate high school, and but I also hold a master's degree. So I have privilege in that part. I have a history of poverty. I grew up in Canada below the line of poverty, and that definitely impacted me in different ways that I'll share. But I am also very ensconced in middle-class financial stability at this point. In Canada, I'm Québécoise, which means French is my first language. I have a culturally different set than the rest of Canada. We, in fact, even use different legal system in Quebec. And outside of Quebec, we're considered a cultural minority, and we have programs such as Saving the French Language Abroad, which means the other provinces. And I'm currently an immigrant, which means that I'm a permanent resident of the US. I have no rights to vote. I have a right to work, a right to pay, and a right to own property. And a right to be deported. So while I am white and have a lot of privilege in that, and that my accent is very slight, which also allows me to hide in plain sight, at different times, that immigrant identity has been pretty prominent in how I've experienced the US and whether or not I was feeling safe locally. And I bring all of those things to my leadership. So I'm going to start with some key defining moments as well. So, and I'll dig through them as I move through other slides. So I shared already that I grew up below the line of poverty. I was raised by a single mother, also an older mother, which meant that there were things that other kids were enjoying with their parents that my mom just didn't have the energy for. During my childhood, I experienced pretty profound trauma throughout my childhood. And that defines a lot of who I became later. So in elementary years, I I went on a government-sponsored scholarship to private school, which is where I learned to read and write English, and probably put me on a very different path than my 12 cousins, only 2 of whom have graduated high school, including myself. I also, however, moved 1 to 2 times per year. I am finally now the same age as the number of times I have moved. No, I'm not telling you my age. We've also, in high school, I relocated to the US. My sister adopted me, and that's where I learned to speak English, and I worked to support my expenses. Then I moved back to Canada for university, and I worked throughout undergrad, including management positions. And I also, during that time, became a disability advocate, so working in referendums and other opportunities. In graduate school, that's when I would say 2 + 2 = 5, and I became a librarian. And I actually aimed for administration, both paths unexpected for me. In an early career, I worked in corporate, but I also hopped to public libraries and eventually to academic. So starting at the start of childhood, sugar and spice is kind of what I thought about when I was thinking about the very early childhood. As a little kid, as you can probably see from the picture on the left of me looking like a rock star with my plastic beads and my cool shades, I had a lot of spunk. I loved to dress up, dance, sing, be the life of the party. My sister is significantly older than me and was critical in raising me during my parents' divorce, after and again as a teenager. So some stories to talk about the high points or the family lores. My sister was already in high school by the time I was a toddler. So her favorite stories to tell my children are that she would have to take me somewhere and be like, do not call me mom. And invariably I'd be like, and shame her. So she repaid that by having a nephew who's 14 years younger than me, and I lived the same thing through high school. And but she also would do things that teenagers would do, right? Like take the money for my haircut and spend it on something else and give me a haircut. So I've had some pretty funky hairstyles, as you can see in that locket. I have very short hair because my sister decided to cut my hair herself and kept going oops over and over until she eventually gave up and just fessed up that she'd use the money for something else. The last story that I think involves some of the love and fun in our family. We were a very large extended family. My mom was hosting Thanksgiving and had left the butter out to warm up. And my sister went into the pantry to take a phone call with her girlfriend and came back out to find me covered in all 4 pounds of butter sitting in the pan. I must have been about 2. But we also had, 12 grandkids. So there's a lot of sleepovers and different moments that were pretty great. Of course, as a teenager, she loved having a tiny sister. She actually named me. My mom wanted to name me Julie, and my sister insisted that I was Annie. She carried me everywhere for the first year, and then eventually also grew to resent the fact that I kept calling her mom all the time. But eventually, I also met people in my life who worked really hard to dim that light. And so I come from a long line of intergenerational trauma. Sexual, physical, and emotional abuse ran throughout the multiple generations that I'm aware of. And so it's been both defining and formative for me. In some cases, it's led to maladaptive behaviors that I've had to really, that were critical to my survival early on, but I've had to learn to overcome, such as toxic productivity, perfectionism, overachieving, but also being hypersensitive to people around you. Right? You're constantly monitoring what's happening around you to know if you need to duck or how you need to act. Now, the flip sides of those, however, have been that I have a lot of generosity. There's enough for 2, there's enough for 5. A lot of compassion for other people's stories and what they might be experiencing. I work very hard to bring care to my leadership. Also an awareness. I'm often the person who notices someone squinting in a room and gets up to shut the shade to make sure that people have what they need to be present. And a very strong work ethic. So surviving these early trials led me to eventually to a place of learning to thrive. And not to lean into toxic positivity. As a survivor of trauma, I have, in part to survive, I have felt that each crack needs to be nurtured and healed and celebrating who we are. So I've shared a picture here of kintsugi, which is the golden joinery, also known as kintsukuroi, golden repair, which is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery by mending the areas of breakage with lacquer, dusted or mixed with powdered gold, silver, or platinum. And Rumi was a poet that was very instrumental to my undergraduate journey. And so the wound is where the light enters. And Leonard Cohen, I've got to bring at least one Canadian singer, the crack is where the light gets in. And so rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. And so healing is an act of communion from bell hooks. So I found a lot of communities and places to heal and try to bring those story with me, also knowing that at times I will also feel things more deeply than others as someone who has chronic PTSD. And so by age 10, I was working. My first job, I was a payroll clerk. Not what most people are doing in 6th grade, but that's okay. By high school, I actually moved to the US in 9th grade, and I was working full-time to help support my expenses. And I was really fortunate, hindsight, I was very fortunate. In 9th grade, I was very resentful. My English teacher realized that I could read and write above 9th grade level, but I could barely speak English. So every time someone else had an essay, she gave me a speaking assignment. So as a 9th grader with a thick accent, who's an introvert, I did not appreciate it then, but I certainly do now. That she saw that there was that potential to grow beyond where I was. There were many paths not traveled. So I started high school in a very impoverished area of New Jersey, and many of my friends left school early to get married to Coast Guard trainees in order to escape home life. That was one of the pathways out. Of my high school friends, 2 of us finished high school, and only 2 of us did not have teenage pregnancies. So one summer I was traveling from Montreal to Virginia to visit friends, and I met a college student whose last name I don't remember, but her first name was Angelique. She was Asian. And that conversation on the bus, her taking interest in a 16-year-old, changed my path, because I was definitely on the same path as my friends. To, what's the point of school? We're all stuck here. We don't have any good jobs, any good leads. And that conversation of her experience in college and leaving behind the poverty of Haiti that she had been experienced changed my path. We relocated to Michigan, and I had the opportunity there to attend a Women in Business conference and the GM Communication Certificate, which squarely put me on the path to college. I think a path my mom never thought I wouldn't have, but one that I definitely had seen slipping away as a teenager. So I had a very winding road to librarianship and have come to believe that nothing learned is ever lost. I did not intend to become a librarian. I set out, when I decided to go to college, to become an international business lawyer. So those who know me really well will probably laugh at that, because I am not very polished, nor am I very aggressive. So being an international business lawyer is an interesting choice. However, life has a way of being a winding path, and I certainly fell backwards into librarianship. So I started out studying business administration, worked at Merrill Lynch, and really decided at that point that I did not want to work in the corporate field in that way. It was very competitive, very toxic, a lot of toxic masculinity at play, and also a lot of addiction at play. So I also wanted to be closer. I'd been in Montreal, wanted to get back closer to Michigan, where my family was living at the time, and also my high school partner. So I switched to York University in Toronto. They don't accept business school transfers, as I learned after. And I ended up flopping around a little bit. I applied to become a school teacher. That lasted all of a week, and realized that probably, while I love teaching, I didn't necessarily want to go into the educational system for K-12. I was in atmospheric chemistry for a while. I loved it. I lost myself in it, in fact. But if you have shaky hands, that's not always, the lab's not the friendliest place for you. And I was not able to get disability accommodations that I needed in the lab at the time. So eventually I switched track to international development with a focus on feminist urban geography and land use by women in developing nations at the time. Part of these switches were also getting scholarships. So by the end of my degree, I had almost 2 minors, economics and chemistry, a degree in social sciences, and I had been working throughout undergrad 1 to 3 jobs to put myself through school and to pay for housing. And my work experiences were heavily in web and database development. I'd also managed a socially conscious educational cafe. It had a vegan cafe, it had a lot of things going on. And so I had these work experiences that didn't necessarily fit well with my degree. And it was a time where my mother needed physical and financial support. So going to England for a master's degree in feminist geography was out of the question. Applying for an internship at the UN, unpaid by the way, was also out of the question. And so within the span of about 1 week, 3 different people asked me if I'd considered being a librarian. I had not at all, never been in my consciousness that was even a job. But sometimes when the universe puts a neon flashing sign in front of you, you pause and check out what it's saying. And, I had 2 different vice presidents that I'd been working for at the university who suggested librarianship to me. And then I had my very first library instruction session, and the person also suggested it to me after I started helping when their assistant didn't come. So when I looked into librarianship, I realized I could get that degree in a year. It seemed like a golden ticket to a government job, which is the golden goose of all secure jobs if you've come from a low-income background. And so off I went to graduate school. I didn't even go to my undergraduate commencement because I was in class. And throughout my degree, I thought, I'll specialize in law librarianship. And I'll really focus on all of those things so that I can keep having more pathways. Of course, in parallel, I also did a mutual funds trading license, and I had web development certification and database certification. So there's always multiple plan Bs coming out, right? So I always had a safety net in mind. Little did I know where librarianship would really take me. And while I went into it for job security and what seemed like a whopping possible salaries at the time of $45,000, I have fully fallen in love with the aspect of being a library leader. And I went from accidental manager very early on. So ideally, we actually create a bit of a path for ourselves and think about what might be next. But the reality is you rarely plan your career down to every detail. And I think that's a benefit. So I really sought to leverage unexpected opportunities as they came up into my life. And while I don't necessarily encourage everybody to never say no, I certainly took every opportunity that popped up. And so within a year out of grad school, I was working as an acting department head for the New Brunswick Public Library Service at the provincial office. I had been working in corporate libraries and I loved it. And I was doing about 90 hours of billable hours, which is very, very high, and had a boss who I would qualify as toxic. I learned a lot of what not to do. And I knew when I wanted to leave the corporate library field, I not only would have to leave corporate libraries, I would likely have to leave the province of Ontario. Because she would call people unsolicited and give negative references, which is actually illegal in Canada, but that's a different story. So when I moved to New Brunswick, I became an accidental manager. I really applied for 2 positions. I applied for the English Public Services librarian role and the English Public Services, I may have said English already, French and English. I applied for both jobs. I ended up having an interview with both the French panel on one side, the English panel on the other side, and we kept switching languages. I got neither position, but I was offered the bilingual position that had not yet been advertised. And in government, if you meet certain points, that can happen. I was quickly promoted to acting department head. And I will say it was both a burnout and a career-making role. I had 10 different portfolios, 65 indirect reports, and more projects than I could ever hope to accomplish. I quickly learned about strategic planning, communication, collaboration, organizational development, how to manage its scales, and some hard HR issues to handle. from sexism and ageism and in fact, perjury in application materials, which is an imprisonable offense when you've applied to a government job. So learned a lot very quickly and was really happy. I loved being in New Brunswick. I got to speak French and English. My partner had a job. I call this the 4 M's, becoming an adult. I had the management job. We bought our first house. We had a mortgage. It was a pit. The house was, the mortgage was low, which was great. We renovated. Eventually we got married and I became a mother. And so in parallel to my role in New Brunswick, we bought that first house, we got married. And when I became pregnant, my spouse wanted to relocate closer to family. So we were over 16 hours away from the closest family member and up to 28 hours from the furthest one. I was up for a promotion for regional director in Campbellton, which is a fully French-speaking district. And the biggest city has 3,500 people. My spouse does not speak French. In fact, he is an Anglo. That's what my family would say. So friends of mine started sending jobs from Ontario to us to lure us back to Ontario, where he's originally from. And for marital peace, as I joked, I applied for a job at the University of Waterloo. They wanted 10 years of management experience. And I thought, I'm never going to get it. I can apply to this and rest on my laurels that my life doesn't have to change. I've since had that conversation with my spouse. He knows the business. Not only did I get an interview, I got the job. So I was 6 months pregnant and moving across the country to a new job, to a new field. And that serendipitous move changed the course of my career. It led me to living in one area for the longest time ever. We were in Waterloo region for 10 years. We still moved 5 times during that time because that's the bug. I formed deeper relationships at work and in the community than ever before than I'd had a chance. And we built our family. We had our daughter and our son while we were there. I had a boss who was also a coach and a mentor, which was very fortunate. My peers provided me with lots of learning opportunities. I had a peer department head, and she used to joke that, I would go up to the beehive and be tapping it to see if there were any bees, and she would be walking behind with the smoker to calm everything down. So I would, foster people to action, and she would help with that coaching. So I also had a lot of project opportunities across the campus and the community partner during that time. I actually created the G20 virtual library with a major corporation when Toronto hosted the G20 and worked with library schools across Canada to make sure that it could be staffed. It really was a time of juggling and fatigue. After my son was born, my husband was laid off. And a local corporation had been trying to recruit me. So with permission from the university president, I actually began doing consulting work. And a lot of that for me was about financial stability. And during that time, we flipped our gender roles and my husband became and remains the primary caregiver. Sometimes people say, how do you do it all? Well, part of it is I have a spouse who is the primary caregiver. That's a huge part of it. I don't have to worry about what's for dinner. So during my time at Waterloo, I think I really went from accidental to intentional leader, and really tried to focus on values-based leadership. So the quote on the screen says from Barack Obama, that values will get you through hard and good times. They're the things that give you meaning and purpose to what you do. And during my time at Waterloo, I learned that for me, I have to be values aligned to the organization I'm in and with the leadership. And so I started as a department head. I became an associate university librarian, which is the equivalent of associate dean. And I was fortunate enough to attend some trainings. But I think most importantly was really spending some time reflecting and deepening my self-awareness for continued growth. Failure is often personal, but it's important that we use those moments to grow, that we should ask ourselves how we might approach that differently, reflect, rather than what is wrong with me or why me, introspect. And at the same time, we need to give ourselves enough compassion to feel our emotions and to process them. And so finding a community of care as a leader became very important during that time. And since then, I have worked to foster those community of cares for other leaders, particularly female leaders. Now, not all of this growth was easy and simple. Leadership maxims, now I use them all the time and they're very simple, but I was often seen as too experienced to participate in leadership development. So often I would act as a mentor in local leadership development efforts at the University of Waterloo. In one mentoring role, we were reading, and I chose to do that as a co-peer learning moment with the person I was mentoring rather than I am the expert on the stage and I shall just download my wisdom to you. We were reading one piece of paper, and I will say this book put me into an existential crisis. I sat there thinking, I have no clue what I'm doing. Why am I a leader? How has no one else found out that I'm not a good leader? And I walked into work the next day, and one of my longtime colleagues, Judy, who was the desk coordinator, asked me what was wrong because I was like physically looked flustered to her. And so I explained what it was, and I was supposed to have all these one-liners that would explain to other people how I lead myself, how I lead people, how I lead thinking, how I lead the change. And I had no clue, and I couldn't possibly figure this out. And she kindly chuckled at my tempest in a teapot, as she called it. And she's like, here are these idioms you use all the time that tell me you know how to do this. And when I came to Grand Valley, someone actually created this graphic out of them. So for projects, you know, the cookie elephant, you can only eat a cookie elephant one bite at a time, and there's no perfect bite. So go ahead and take one. Used to say it was an elephant, but that seemed a little too aggressive. So we made it a cookie. You know, for how I lead change, we should consult people as though we're eating a gobstopper from the middle. So the most impacted first should be the ones who get the most voice, and then we can work our way out. And how I lead, I would say both myself and others, is the boulder in the path. So, well, actually myself, right? So when there's an obstacle in our path, we can move it, we can go around it, we can go over it, or stay in place. And various factors can impact that. But I tend to figure a way around the obstacle. So that's my bias to action. And then for other people, I try to pay attention because they'll remember how you made them feel. I've also done a lot to invest in my growth. I was fortunate to be sponsored to do these, the first two as an ARL Leadership Fellow, which meant I got to visit 5 different universities across North America to see how different people lead and what kind of university leader I might want to be, and to create a call for it. The Leadership Management Institutes were critical in teaching me how to be a good supervisor and how to think about setting vision and strategic planning. And since I've been at Grand Valley, I have self-funded more learning, including the certificate in creating positive change and embodied social justice. So continue to work to foster a growth mindset in myself. Now, I also think it's really important to be authentic, so that you should take your work seriously and not yourself. I'll explain this image. This is the Dana Porter Library where I worked at for 10 years. And that is a microwave that is on fire in the corner. One day, in the middle of exam cram, I decided to warm up a cookie. And the cookie sparked and caused smoke. And I evacuated a 10-story building at capacity. And so we're all outside waiting for the firefighters to come and tell us that we can go back in. And I'm telling people, like, it's my fault. I did it. And everybody thinks I'm just joking, but that's the reality. Sometimes we take the good with the bad. And for weeks after, people kept putting different signs on the microwave, like, are you sure you need to use it? Is it safe? And when I left, we had a student ambassador program that I had started, which was to give library job to students who had no employment history. And they organized my going away party. There was enough candy that the entire library smelled of candy. So I guess I eat more healthily now, because I don't know that people would think that I'm a huge candy eater. But they also put together a video reel of all the different photos of me laughing, including somebody created a GIF of the library burning because of my cookie. And we took it all in good stride. Now, of course, I've talked about both in corporate library and public libraries working very, very high amounts of work. And so I've had over the time of my career had to fight back on perfectionism and toxic productivity. And so I'll provide two definitions to help us be centered, but in toxic productivity, it's defined as overworking at the expense of other facets of our lives. It's a mindset that manifests as the need to constantly do. You may feel you can't rest or take any downtime. Whereas perfectionism is a personality trait associated with striving to be flawless and often involves being critical of imperfections for others or yourself. So in New Brunswick, I was working close to 90 hours a week, which is why I say it was a burnout role. To accomplish all the work was just a very high amount of work. I ended up getting ill while I was pregnant, and that was probably my first wake-up call. Is in my last few weeks of work, and I had been coming into the office at 3 a.m. to get work done before the day started. And one morning, around 5 a.m., my arm went numb, and then my face started going numb. By 6 a.m., clearly not in my right mind, I texted my spouse to say, I'm going to go ahead and drive myself to the hospital. I don't feel well. He met me there, and at the time they thought that I was having a stroke. My boss kept calling the hospital to ask me questions about an event that was coming up, and kept, eventually the neurologist says he has a needle in my foot to see if I can feel it, took the phone, told her never to call again, and hung up. So I really had to think about, what does that mean? And how do we show care when others are ill? And as soon as I came home, I wasn't supposed to work for another 2 weeks. And my boss brought me donuts and a pile of files to ask me questions about. And that's probably when I started to reckon with the fact that I was in fact chronically ill and had to think differently about what I would do when I returned from maternity leave to moderate and change my approach. And so I started using work-life blending. So I would be in the office early after dropping off Zoe to daycare, and then leave early to pick her up and have dinner. And then once she was old enough, often I'd be in the bathroom wrapping up emails while she played in the bathtub. And so I was really being focused on being present when spending time with them, as well as supporting the family, rather than having hard boundaries. For me, it was really important that we had dinner together and that I was there to help them do homework, particularly when they were in French school and my spouse didn't speak any French. And so I learned to focus on what is good enough rather than perfection. And that is an ongoing role. But also increasingly, I think we need to challenge urgency in both our projects and our effort. Urgency, like toxic productivity, are symptomatic of white supremacy culture. And we need to constantly say, is this in fact important enough? And while we don't always have the agency to change the urgency, that's where developing boundaries can be really helpful. Now, if we're going to hold boundaries for ourselves, we have to be okay that boundaries for other people may be different. So for example, as a simple boundary, I will not come to work with a fever because I'm either contagious or having an autoimmune flare. But if someone sends me an evening text about an urgent matter, I will answer. Those are the boundaries that I'm comfortable with. And I also find that using the strategic yes and has helped me be successful in fighting back on perfectionism and toxic productivity. So if I get a big ask, often I might want to say no, but I'll try to say, what's the one thing I can do within this, or what is one area that I can think about? And also make time to just not be at work, to not be a leader. So the picture on the screen currently is from several years ago. We went to St. Louis for spring break, and that's my oldest, Zoe, at the time, much younger. She's still missing teeth in that picture. Pretending she's being eaten by a hippo and just being silly and being in the moment during that time. She is now taller than me, so I'm having different reflection moments now as she's about to turn 14. The last formal piece I wanted to talk about was defining a vision. So I've talked a little bit about my values and how being values aligned has been really important for me. And for me, those values have been, empathy, equity-centered, compassion, a bias to action, But also I want to make sure that as a leader, I focus on healthy organizational culture and growing future leaders. And so in many ways, a lot of my professional practice outside of the library is also to train and develop and mentor up and coming leaders. And so in some ways, my leadership vision is to lead and develop people so that they can have a healthy organizational culture anchored in empathy and equity, and that I bring values-based, compassionate leadership. And that means a lot around human-centered and questioning where can we shift power, but also being very clear where power does lie sometimes. Now, I would do a disservice if as a library dean I didn't share my library vision. And so when I think about why I became a library leader and why I still continue to be a library leader, it's that libraries are critical in a democratic society. They're critical in working towards a socially just world. And they're the third place with the moral imperative to support knowledge creation and provide a platform to amplify underrepresented voices. Now, since I'm also an educator, I am going to actually have you do some exercises. I want you to define your why. So your why statement should be simple and clear. It should be actionable, focused on how you'll contribute to others, and expressed in affirmative language that resonates with you. This is really about what makes it for you. So as you consider leadership, you can always decide how, why, and from where you're going to choose to lead. And so this is why I'd like you to think about, if everyone can be a leader from where they are, then I'd like you to think about your why. So if I just go back a slide, for me, it's to lead and develop people so that we can have a healthy organizational culture anchored in empathy and equity. And I've left lots of time at the end as well for some questions. So I'm going to have you go into breakout rooms for about 7 minutes. I'd love if some folks are willing to share theirs, but also, how did you experience the process of thinking that through? If you want to raise your hand or speak into the room or in the chat. Yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Annie, I'll share that. It's difficult for me. I'm a processor, so I need a little bit more time to think on the prompt. So I had a really nice conversation with one of your colleagues from the library just about, how we engage with our work and that kind of thing. So nice to meet new colleagues and have a conversation. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that as well. It was just nice to have a conversation and to reconnect with people that I've met, but also people that I hadn't met. So that opportunity to have that little breakout room was really valuable.
So we can send the prompt as a follow-up as well, and for you to keep thinking about that, because what is your purpose ultimately is what anchors us as human beings. And it doesn't always have to be a visionary purpose, right? Sometimes on a weekend, it's to rest so that I can be a good mother. Maybe my purpose. Yeah. I'll share my screen again. This is a tool that I have found really helpful, which is that we want to self-reflect. I've talked a little bit about that before, right? Self-reflection helps us to grow and can sometimes lean into the guilt we feel about our impact. Shame rarely is about growth. So it's better to not engage in a shame spiral and instead own our impact and do better. And one of the ways we can self-reflect is the learning loop. And you can do this very quickly, 1 minute. You can journal it for hours, up to you. But what did I try? Where did I succeed? Where did I struggle? What did I learn? And what will I try next? Are some of the tools that I have found really just as a way to, at least once a week, check in with myself. So we're at the portion of the Q&A because I wanted to leave lots of time for dialogue. So I will stop sharing and really see what people can do. Yeah. And someone shared in the chat to empower others so they can thrive in 4 dimensions: career, education, financial, physical, and emotional well-being. Any questions, thoughts? Yeah, Lisa?
So this is just a simple question. First of all, thank you very much for your talk. I appreciated your sharing and your insights. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the concept of bias to action.
Mhm.
I'm not sure I understand what that refers to.
Yeah, so for me, I just know that I tend to think and move very, very fast. And so when I'm looking at an obstacle, I am more likely to try to flip that obstacle to an opportunity, or I'm more likely to try and find the pathway through the boulders and move forward. So I will, that often means I'm decisive, or so I have to sometimes make sure that I pace and slow myself down to knowing that I have that bias to action. There are times where we just need to sit with people and to hear. You know, I think about during coronavirus, I helped teach a course on leading in the time of Corona. And my co-presenter also had a bias to action. And we had to build in time for grief. Like, there are leaders right now in this cohort who are losing colleagues. And we have to, while they're my bias to action would be to hold space for grief, right? So find that action. Does that help, Lisa? Because I know it's a bit of an odd one as a value. I think that one maybe is me being really honest about who I am.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I was interested in what it was referring to. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last call for questions, last call for questions.
Annie, you talked about questioning urgency. Can you share an example where you've done that?
Yeah, so for example, recently with hiring searches, that always feels, for me, I've always been trained, when you have a line, you hire now. You actually, if you could have hired yesterday, you were better off. And recently we had 3 open lines in the exact same department, and we actually could not do a joint search. So questioning urgency was to actually say, how do we pace this so that the hiring manager is also being centered in care and compassion? Because sometimes when we talk about human-centered, we also have to stop and say, who is being centered? And why are they being centered? And is it at the cost of someone else that's too high? Right? So when we use, I forgot the name. There's a type of facilitation where you purposely take, Emily will probably come up with the word because I know she's very good at these topics. I know how to do it. I just can't remember the title of it, where if you know there's a dominant view in the room, you actually, as the facilitator, put yourself in the non-dominant view to give it more equal weight. And so sometimes I use that tool to question urgency, to say, like, why is this urgent? How is this urgent? Right? So often when I see people do goals planning, we list all the goals and then they all start in January. Let's question that. Let's actually spread out throughout the year. And even more, let's actually say what we're not going to do in January, because of that mental load where, I mean, I know I have a to-do list that can fill pages, probably like everyone else on this talk today. But if I say, like, I'm not going to touch that thing until March, I'm making emotional and mental space to do the other work that I have, rather than trying to make all of my priorities urgent, because then I ultimately won't prioritize anything or could cause harm.
Thanks.
I just want to, in the chats, someone just echoed that I'm absolutely right about my bias to action, that others might have a tendency to spend a lot of time examining the boulder and they need a little bit of a nudge. So hopefully I'm not nudging. I am nudging rather than pushing people through looking at the boulders.
Awesome. I love the boulder analogy. Thank you very much for spending the time together. Thank you all for coming. May you all have confidence in the value you provide to this university. And when you lack in that confidence, may you have some courage to reach out to the people in this room across campus to help, because there's another way to move that boulder, and that's with a lot of people. And so remember that. So thank you all for coming. Annie, exceptional. Thank you very much. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys on the other side of this storm. Storm Olivia, I think it is. Is that the right word? I think it's the name. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Annie.
Thanks, everyone.